So, you love games so much you want to make one yourself. First of all, great. Making games is an incredibly rewarding process. I believe there's a great balance between technical know-how and creativity to make the whole process fun. However, it can also be bewildering knowing where to start. The best advice, despite its triteness, is just to start. Pick a path and keep working at it until you have good results. The odds are you won't choose anything too obscure or difficult, and if you stick with it, after about half a year you should have built up the skills to move to any platform you want. But what should that initial path be? Well, this video gives you some options. There are two main ways to make a game. The first is by using a game engine, and the second is by programming. Note that game engines do require some programming knowledge. Also note that programming languages alone aren't enough to make a graphical game. No language, no major language, gives you a native way of drawing graphics inside a window or gathering user input. Instead, doing these things is very complicated and often requires talking directly to the driver installed on your system. Luckily, other people have written this code for you. It's presented for us in the form of an API, or Application Programming Interface. You may have heard of DirectX or OpenGL. Both are APIs used within a language. So, number one, game engine. Some of these engines are purely code-based, but most have a graphical user interface. Tools like Unity and Unreal Engine, both more or less free, give you a screen on which to drag game objects and watch them interact. I have Unity open here, and this is a game object. You can move them around, scale them, rotate them, and stuff like that, and you can add properties and behavior onto them with scripts. In Unity, this scripting facility is written in C#, or you can also use a JavaScript-like language, and in Unreal Engine this is in C++. So this is Unity opening the program it uses to run its scripts, and this is C# here. Now these engines can be incredibly powerful. After only a couple of weeks following their extensive online tutorials, you can have your own 3D games, as graphically complex as a professional project. Oddworld New and Tasty, which was a 3D remake of the classic game Oddworld Abe's Odyssey, seen here, this was made in Unity. The Arkham Batman games were mostly made in Unreal Engine. It's amazing that these tools are free for us novices to use. However, there are a number of drawbacks. The most practical issue is that they're not really free, in the sense of free software. Some are, but the most powerful engines, such as Unity, Unreal Engine, Game Maker, aren't. They have restrictions built in. In the case of Game Maker, some features are only available after paying a one-time fee. For example, with the free version, you can only deploy to Windows. Unity is free to use, but if you release any game which makes more than a certain amount of cash, you have to pay royalties. Nevertheless, none of this might really matter to you. If you just want to make a few hobby games, tools like Unity and Unreal Engine are good enough. So, why ever follow the second approach? Why spend ages learning how to code when you can use a game engine, where you only need to fit in a few custom scripts here and there? Well, the answer, at least for me, is that I want to know how games are made. I'm interested not just in game design, in turning a cool idea I've had into a game, but I'm also interested in how this is realized in code. If you're interested in programming, you shouldn't use a game engine. You should use a programming language. Whilst it'll take a huge amount of work to match the 3D graphical power of Unity, I really don't think writing a simple 2D game, which is where you're going to start, is any more complicated in a game engine than learning how to code it yourself. Plus, you have a huge amount of control over that game. Of course, with great power comes great responsibility, but with a good teacher, you shouldn't shoot yourself in the foot too much. If you think it'll be more rewarding to quickly get a nice looking game, use an engine. You can focus on art assets and level design. If you think it'll be more rewarding to program your game from scratch, do that. Personally, I've learnt a hell of a lot about computing in general from taking the programming route. Okay, so having chosen option number 2 because it's the best, you're presented with another difficult choice: which programming language? Well, I'm going to tell you something mind-blowing here. It doesn't really matter. Sure, professional games are mostly made in C++ and DirectX or OpenGL, but you're not a professional. You can make great-looking games in any language you like, be it assembly, C, C++, C#, D, Java, Python, JavaScript, Lua, or even Fortran. You get the point. Someone somewhere has made a game with one of these languages. If this is enough for you, pick one up, go on the internet, look up some resources, spend half a year learning it, and go and have some fun. However, if you need more, I'll give you two options: Python and C++. We'll do a quick overview of each before we conclude. So, Python is a general purpose programming language. That means it doesn't favour one way of doing things. C++ is the same in this way. However, Python's design philosophy is different than C++. It emphasises code readability, extending itself through libraries rather than providing a bulky language core, and was named after Monty Python's Flying Circus. Python was deliberately made to be fun to use. There's a great community and many resources for learning the language. Games made in Python are usually made through the use of the API Piglet, which is an awesome name. Python is cool, and I'd recommend learning it at some point, even if you don't do so straight away. C++ has a very long pedigree. The language was made in 1983, nearly 10 years before Python was, as an evolution of the language C, which itself was made more than 43 years ago. C++ was designed with an emphasis on systems programming, so making things like the kernels of operating systems. Windows is written in C, with performance and efficiency rather than readability in mind. C++ is used in most commercial games due to this efficiency. DirectX and OpenGL were both made for C++. The language also comes with something called the standard library, providing a huge amount of flexibility. You can do almost any kind of programming in C++. Whether this is a good thing or not is debatable. The language is also hugely influential. Later versions of C, as well as C#, Java, D, and loads of other languages were directly influenced by C++. Nevertheless, it has a bad reputation at the moment. Many people will point you towards Java or Python due to the apparent complexity of C++. As the latter gives you so much power, it's easy to mess things up, step on your toes. Seemingly simple things, such as splitting a string in half. A string is a list of characters, like hello world or gello world. Splitting something like this in half requires a huge amount of work. In fact, there's no native support for strings in the language at all. To someone starting out, this seems ridiculous and infuriating. Nevertheless, C++ isn't as hard as people make it out. Indeed, the difficulty is just an artifact, I think, of how it's taught. Many people learnt it a couple of decades ago when it was taught the same way as C. There are lots of fantastic resources available now that make C++ a really viable beginner's language. It may seem intimidating at first, but C++ will teach you much more about how computers work and how proper games are made. I learnt to program on C++. So here is some sample code. This is C++, which prints the phrase hello world to the screen. By screen I mean console window, which is this thing here. You'll run it inside this little thing and it'll say hello world. And for Python the same thing is achieved through that one line. So that's the difference between them. In conclusion, as I've said, it doesn't really matter how you go about making games or what language or tool you use. However, I do hope this video has given you a good heads up on what would best suit your own needs and your own interests. As I say, personally I use C++ and an API called SDL to make games. If you want more information on resources for learning C++, there's a video linked in the description, and if you want a tutorial series on making games in C++ and SDL, then that's also linked, both made by me. So thank you very much for watching.